Hello, and good evening. I welcome everybody, firstly those that I see and many that I don't see. It's always amazing when you think about it, how you could just sit in one little corner in a basement and broadcast, and who knows who's listening, and really reach anybody. So that's I always like to mention it, even though it's become now common, but it's still, if you think about it, pretty mysterious actually how it works. But getting to the topic at hand, being that we're in the month of El, which is the last month of the Hebrew year, and also the introduction and preparation for the new year, Rosh Hashanah coming in 3 weeks, approximately. And it's also, as we all know, I've discussed many times, that there is a Torah, which is essentially the blueprint for existence, a blueprint for life, a Torah that has 52 chapters corresponding to the 52 weeks in the year. And each chapter is broken down into 7 sections corresponding to each day of the 52 weeks. In effect, every day has its so-called spiritual direction in the Parsha. So we're now in the book of Deuteronomy, the book which is the 5th book of the Torah, which will be concluded every year on Simchas Torah. That's when we conclude it. That's why we dance and celebrate, and then we begin the cycle again from Bereshis, essentially after the holiday season. So the week we're in now is Parsha Cliche. It's named by the first words of the chapter. And cliche is actually referring to war. Cliche l'milchama alevecha is the verse that states that when you will wage war, to be more precise, when you will go out and wage war. Cliche in Hebrew means to go out and wage war alevecha upon your enemies. And then it continues that God will give you those enemies in your hands, that you'll be victorious. And it continues with the laws and regarding the spoils of war, regarding what is ethical, what is not ethical behavior in war. So it's a fascinating chapter and with many themes. But I want to focus on is primarily the beginning, the opening verse. And hence the title of this week's class is Are You Battle Weary? Transcending Life's Struggles, the struggles of life. As most people, especially not children, will tell you that life ends up being a battle, that we're constantly fighting different battles. That doesn't mean necessarily with physical weapons and with bloodshed, but battles can take place, battles at home, battles at work, battles in communities, battles between ideologies, religions, nations, and of course the biggest battle of all, the battle within your own psyche, within your own self. The conflicts between what the mind tells you, what the heart tells you. The battles between the fears and insecurities that we may have picked up as we growing up as children. The different haunting forces or voices that somewhat impede us, in some way trap us, which is really essentially why people go to therapy, because we're trying to find something we don't have, whether it's happiness, whether it's inner peace, whether it's just being able to have healthy relationships. I mean, the list goes on. You could fill in the blanks. Everybody has their story. But it all can be captured in the context of life being a battlefield. Now, hopefully it's not a battlefield 24/7, but there always something's going to come up. Tomorrow morning you go to work, and who knows what kind of co-workers you have, clients, employers, employees. Everybody's got their share of, let's call it, I don't want to use the word hostile forces, but definitely uncomfortable people in our lives. And it could be family members. Some of us dread holidays. You don't want to go and meet certain family members that make you crazy. Tensions, confrontations, and so on. I'm only giving examples because just to identify with everybody's particular issues. And I'm sure what I've said fits the bill to some extent. And as I said, if I haven't mentioned a certain battle, that's not because I don't mean it, it's just because you can't mention every possible scenario. we would spend the rest of our lives here going through every possible confrontation. But the bottom line is a battle is defined by a confrontation, defined by something that's tense, something that's not smooth, that's not harmonious. Good friends, really good friends, don't battle with each other. They may have different disagreements, but it's not something that you dread. War and battle is something that we don't like. Nobody likes it. Even though some of us have become warriors and thrive on battles, but no one's born a battler. That's the real truth. Look at children. Yeah, children can suddenly become upset at each other, but look how long it lasts. You have children who say, I'll never talk to you the rest of my life, and then 30 seconds later, they're best friends. We wish adults could do it that way. Adults is the other way around. You may never say that, but one little thing happens, then you never talk to the other person the rest of your life. Or you carry it inside of you. How many of us have, for example, certain situations we just dread, like meeting an ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend, or somebody you just don't want to meet, and then you meet them in a restaurant or at a party, and how it upsets your whole day or your whole life. And then we have people we've had different hostile interactions with, and we just want to avoid them. So there's a whole slew of different elements that connect to the battles of our lives. And as you get older, some of us get more jaded, more resigned to the fact that we just get drained and battle weary. That's why, are you battle weary? You just get worn down, worn out, and drained by all these confrontations, and we start lowering our expectations. Now, of course, this takes on a whole new dimension when it comes to relationships. A good marriage is a good marriage, but a bad marriage is a living hell, because it means that in your home, in your own domain, where things should be calm, it's one thing you have hostility, tensions outside your home, but your home is the only place of your refuge. If that is upset, then your nest is not, your hearth is not peaceful. And that's why Shalom Bayis is in Judaism considered like the biggest blessing possible, to have a home, at least an environment that's peaceful, because there's enough confrontations going on, you don't need one in your home as well. And what it does to children, on and on. So if you're a child of a marriage that was somewhat volatile, that was not balanced, that was not peaceful, you know what I'm talking about. It's like being in a war zone. Sometimes the war zone is more overt, sometimes less overt, but it has tremendous impact on our lives. Because children especially need stability. They want balance, they need stability, they need the security to know their parents are there for them, that there's no yelling and screaming, that there's a calm, you go to sleep in a peaceful way, not going to sleep trembling, because you never know when the next battle is going to break out. And we're not even discussing, of course, abuse, where the children are hurt or in some other ways. So this issue is not a small matter. It really affects every aspect of our lives, is what I really want to convey here. And therefore, addressing this topic is extremely important, because it really addresses what we do with these battles. How do we fight them? As I said, many of us have just given up, and we just try to minimize confrontation. We try to retreat, so to speak, instead of engaging. Some of us, the other extreme, we become fighters, and we're always ready for a fight, and we become very adept at it, and then you start looking back at yourself. You say, what am I, a warrior? I mean, your whole life is about fighting. As a matter of fact, there's an interesting episode in the Bible, in the Torah. So we all know the story after the Jews left Egypt. So a week later, or even less, it's on the 7th day of Passover, they end up being by the Yam Suf, by the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea. And behind them are the pursuing Egyptians, who decided to have a change of heart. They decided they don't want to let the Jews go. So they have the Egyptians behind them, the sea in front of them, but a rock and a hard place. A predicament. Yet another battle. And what are we supposed to do? So Jews are smart people. So the Talmud tells us that they broke into 4 camps, 4 different opinions of how to deal with this challenge. One group said, let's go to war. We'll go to war with the Egyptians. Enough is enough. They're pursuing us. Let's go to war. Another group went the other extreme. No, let's surrender. Let's return to Egypt. Enough of this time to be free. They're pursuing us. They're stronger than us. Let's just surrender and return to Egypt. And then a third group said, no, let's pray to God. The religious group. We'll pray to God for salvation. And the fourth group said, let's commit suicide. Let's jump into the sea and just put the whole thing to an end. Which camp would you choose if you were in that situation? Okay, you don't have to answer. Think about it. But Moses, hearing all these different opinions, turns to God and says, so what should we do? Which one is it? And God rejects all four opinions. In the verse, that's how the Talmud derives it from the response that God gives to Moses, what to do. So you have one verse that says, tell them to be silent. I will go to war for them, which negates two camps. Silent means they should not pray, let them be quiet. And number two, they shouldn't go to war. I will go to war for them. And then there's another two statements that state that they should not move forward, meaning jumping into the ocean. And the fourth statement, which is they should not return to Egypt. They will never see Egypt again. So God negates all four arguments. The argument of war, surrender, prayer, and suicide. What's left? So what's the fifth option? So one word God tells Moses. He says, Vayiso, you shall move forward. As I told you when you left Egypt, that I'm taking the people out of Egypt, we're going to Mount Sinai, and then we're marching toward the promised land. Why do you doubt my promise? Just move forward. And one man, Nachshon ben Amminadav, took the lead, and he walked into the water, not in order to drown, but move forward, and what happens is the water parts. That's the story. Now, I've discussed this a number of times in these classes, but when you think about it, it's an interesting approach. It's not war, it's not surrender, and it's not prayer nor suicide. It's just focusing on the positive and moving forward as you were promised, as you were given the power to do, and not allowing the distraction, even of the confrontation, to disturb your momentum. That's essentially the lesson, which I'm going to elaborate upon. But when you bring it into this week's chapter, cliche, the question begs immediately when you read the chapter, the verse. There are two words that seem strange. In Hebrew, cliche le'milchama alevecha, in English is translated when you will go out to wage war upon your enemies. Now what's missing? What's wrong here? What is this going out and what is this upon? It should have said in Hebrew, kisilcham imayvecha, when you will wage war with your enemies. And you don't need the extra kiseitze, which means you'd see it going out. And alevecha, not upon, but be'ayvecha, or imayvecha in Hebrew, with your enemies, or against your enemies. What is this upon? Al suggests that you're upon, you're higher than they are. So these two changes, and if you're familiar with the precision of every word in Torah, Torah looks to always be brief and very precise. It's very surgical. Everything is extremely precise and very brief. So these words definitely carry some message. And as you'll see when you combine this verse with the story I just shared about what happened at the sea and the Egyptians, you'll see tremendous lessons to life as it is today and our own battles. Because most of us, how we address the battles of our lives are with the limited tools that we have. Now remember, once you feel you're embattled, and once you're affected by that, that alone is a demoralizing element. So besides the battle itself, what strengths, what resources do you have to fight a battle? So most of us think the way to win war is to develop strategies, develop skills, fighting skills, develop an army, whether it's a physical army or a psychological army, an arsenal, weapons. So you're well armed to face any challenge that comes your way. That's how most people would say that's how you fight a battle. As we shall soon see, that's absolutely not how you fight a battle. That may be necessary in the technical aspect of it, but the real wars and real victories are not won in the battlefield. They're won in your mind and heart. Winners and losers in history, the battles was all in their minds. It all began from there. It wasn't the strongest armies that always were victorious. It was the ones that were convinced that they could win, and they had that total conviction and total confidence. For example, you take the Nazis, for instance, with all the obscenity, and I don't want to use them as a case study, obviously, but their army was not as stronger than many other armies, and yet they were literally marching to conquer the world. Had they not made some major missteps, for example, had they just left the Jews alone, some people dread the fact what could have happened. That means they spend so many resources on their hatred of Jews, it had to so-called deplete some of their other resources. Had they not fought on two fronts at the same time? Had the Russian winter not weakened them? There's so many factors that could have allowed them to conquer the world literally. And they were about to do it. Had they had the atom bomb a little earlier, etc., etc. How is that possible that one country, with all their strategies and it was the conviction, because what Hitler was able to do was fire up a passion that the Germans had. You could see it in his eyes and in their eyes, almost demonic passion, that they are supermen and they can do no wrong and they can conquer anything. They were so filled with confidence. Like you see, I don't want to compare it, but you see, let's say, before any two teams in sports, you see how the coaches or the managers or whatever it is hype up with a pep talk each of their sides, because so much of it is the confidence and the experience and the belief that you could win. That's more important than actual skill. It's basically, psychological warfare is more important than actual warfare. This has become even more so in our day and age. So you all have heard of Sun Tzu, was approximately 2,500 years ago. He lived. He was a Chinese philosopher and a strategist, military strategist, and wrote what's called one of the classics, the greatest books on war, called The Art of War. You know, it's known to be a book that like set the tone of this is many years ago, 2,500 years ago. And he has a line in that book that says that battles are won before the fight begins. Battles are won and lost before the fight begins. And this is a fundamental principle in all military strategy. What does that mean? The fight hasn't even begun. How could you win a war? Because it all comes down to if you're able to outmaneuver and have more confidence than your enemy, then you're in a far stronger position. Once you're already fighting on the battlefield, there's a lot of things that could happen that will make one side lose or win. But what really, really determines winners and losers is what happens before the war even begins. And so everyone attributes it to him. As we shall see, the chapter cliche was written before Sun Tzu. He's 2,500 years ago. The Torah was given through 3,300 years ago. A little more than that, 3,347 years ago, I believe, or 3,327 years ago, I should. So more than 1,000 years, almost more than a little 800 years before him. You'll see from this chapter, you have this lesson understanding what really is the key to battles. And I'm not really focusing now on battles on battlefields in the physical sense. Obviously, I'm focusing mostly on our own personal lives. Now, why is this so relevant to this month? Because, let's be honest, we're prepared for a new year. The things we pray for, besides health and livelihood and sustenance and nachas and joy from our children, hopefully finding the right relationships, sustaining our relationships, but it also comes down to praying for a year where you and I, all of us, can find a deeper inner peace to be able to live our lives and fulfill our potential. And I've often thought about it, but I don't know if you can ever come up with statistics. How much time do we spend on fighting darkness, demons in our lives? How much time would you say, an average day, does your mind preoccupied with negative stuff? Like people that have hurt you and how to get even, or the bitterness and anger around it, or vengeance or resentment and so on. And how much time do you spend on positive thinking? I'm no doubt most people have more negative energy going on than positive energy, which means two things. First of all, the negative energy becomes like a cancer. It eats away at you. And number two, it doesn't allow you to bring positive energy because the toxins are occupying your life. Again, I can't speak for everybody, but this is based on my little experience, meeting people and so on. And it's such a tragedy when you think about it, that you could imagine you're able to free yourself from all those occupying demons in your mind and heart and just focus on positive growth, how to actualize your potential. I told this once to someone who I found to be very angry and bitter at a lot of things in their lives, and he answered me a very interesting answer. He said to me, I wouldn't know what to do if I didn't have demons. That's all I'm used to. I'm terrified if I wouldn't have something to fight over, because that's what he became accustomed to. It's like once you become accustomed to toxic air, fresh air can be very dangerous, if you know what I'm saying. What I mean dangerous is because you're not used to it. and it seems strange, and you may not even be able to adapt to it immediately. It's like a very hungry person suddenly starts gouging on food, and they can kill themselves. So much of our lives are defined by circumstances that have turned us into battlers. Go back to the family again, to the home life. Children who grow up in a hostile environment or in a home that's not peaceful, what do they learn to do? They learn to protect themselves. They learn to be very distrustful. They learn to be constantly on alert. You'll see some people develop unbelievably sensitive antennae, very, very sensitive to any type of dangerous situation, because they need to survive. So when you grow up in an environment where there's battles, that's what happens. Against your will even. You may not even want it, but you become essentially on high alert all the time. Everything that happens, you're always looking, where's the next attack going to come from? Because that's what you've gotten used to, and you're learning to try to protect yourself. And by contrast, someone growing up in a home where day after day they were reinforced and nurtured, and it was beautiful. Parents spoke beautifully to each other. Obviously every home has its challenges, but I'm talking about overall an environment. So you go to sleep at peace, you wake up at peace. You're not on high alert and hyper alert on when is the next dagger or the next bullet coming from, psychologically speaking. It's a whole different attitude to life. So again, I don't think there's statistics. I don't even know if we know how much energy and time is invested in our so-called negative thoughts. But there's definitely a lot of time. There's many ways you can measure that, not necessarily in statistic-wise, but at least knowing it from the amount of time people go to therapy, self-medicate, addictions of different sorts, and other ways acting out that are a result. These are symptoms of something. Where you're in pain. You're in psychic and existential pain and loneliness. You're doing something to try to relieve that pain. That is a battle. That means you're fighting a battle. Whether you like it or not, that's called a battle. It's a battle with something inside of you that you're just not comfortable with. So you have to either numb it or act out on it or whatever it is that we do. We either become too promiscuous and too aggressive, or the other way around. We shut down and so on. Again, everybody's got their methods and tools, and sometimes things shift from one to another and so on. So this idea of battle occupying all of our lives, or a big part of our lives, also that itself becomes a vicious cycle, because what do you do then? It's not just the battle anymore. You've now become a battler. Your whole attitude is one that, so you become in a way your own worst enemy. Because it's not just an objective adversarial force in your life, it's also your attitude is that everything is potential adversary. So then your own attitude is one that is constantly on this type of alert. There's no peace of mind, because you never know when the next assault will come on your life. And then it's just to make the picture even bleaker, and that's not my goal here. Obviously, we're going to have a happy ending, so please don't, But to make it even bleaker, if you think about the insidious messages that we receive all day, not necessarily from enemies, but from friends even. Advertising. What is advertising if not an assault on your psyche and on your emotions, trying to get you to buy something? So it may not be an assault in the sense abusive, in the overt sense of the word, or hostile, but it's still an assault. It's stimulating your senses. Your sight, your sound, taste, touch, and smell. You go into a supermarket, you go into a store, you walk down the street. The lights, the colors, the sounds, the smells. It's all been choreographed by somebody to get you to do something. Statistics show that in the Western world, by the time you're 20 years old, you've seen or heard 1 million advertisements. That's a lot. Now, you may not even know that. You don't think you have 1 million ads in your mind, but you've been exposed to it, and it has an effect. Or else these people wouldn't be paying for advertisements, because if it didn't have an effect. When you're younger, you think that advertising affects everybody but yourself. Then you realize that, hey, people are drinking Coca-Cola for a reason. Now, we don't even see this as an enemy. We see it as part of our culture, our freedom, actually, that people can advertise. And again, I'm not turning marketing into a demon, but the fact of the matter is, it is another assault on our psyches. Don't ever think it's less than that. Because bottom line is, it's demanding something from you. It's stimulating you. It's hyper-stimulating. And we're inundated. Just look at your life, How many times did you look today? How many hours were spent looking at a screen? Whether a mobile, desktop, laptop, iPad, and all the whole other... Excuse me. Thank you. Maybe I said something wrong. The advertisers of the world are on... I'm not trying to offend anybody. So what's happening is it's not letting you be yourself. It's a demand on you, an expectation. And then there's the competition. This one dresses that way. I want to look good. I want to feel good. And all the things that are sold to us. Why are you driving this type of car? Why do you smoke this cigar? Why do you not smoke? Everything is covered. Everything, from all angles. How you drink, what you drink, everything from fashion to medication, to the list goes on. And it's coming at us in every possible direction. Things that we don't even, some of them is subliminal, some of it is very direct, etc., etc. So when you really think about it, if you were to unplug and just sit in the woods near some water and have no outside stimulation, except natural, no artificial stimulation, and no computers and so on, and just be able to spend a week like that there, what would you think would happen? Most of us would say impossible. I have people I have to be in touch with. I'm getting texts, I'm getting emails, I have so on and so forth. We do have the concept of vacation, and hopefully there you say at least you minimize these type of this type of superficial stimulation, but it's not something that most of us are accustomed to. And above all, we start wondering, what would you really be like if you were on your own and you didn't have all this stimulation? It could be quite terrifying. Because at the end of the day, all this stimulation actually is a great oasis and escape from having to face yourself. Because you don't have to deal with yourself. You have all these outer things that are entertaining you or stimulating you. So you could live vicariously, as I know some people do, many people do, through soap opera characters or through sports or through movie stars. There's a whole list of heroes, so to speak, that become we live our lives through them. So this is painting all the negative picture, because half the cure of every illness is awareness. We need to know what we're facing. So we're facing, thank God, it's different type of battles than Nazis and Bolsheviks and different enemies that go to war, real bloodshed and death and sentence. But don't ever think that this is not a life and death battle as well. It's just a different life and death. It's not life and death perhaps in the physical, biological definition of life and death, but it's life and death spiritually and emotionally. Because there's no way that you can build a really healthy relationship if you're living in fear and in battle and being stimulated by all kinds of forces that are not from within you. This is a bitter pill to swallow, but very often when I counsel couples, so one of the things I always ask them is, so when you go to sleep, the television, of course, is probably playing, right? Most people, the television is on. So the television is in the bedroom. So the only time you, after a long day, you're coming home and you're with each other as a couple, you have a television to hide behind, because you have to watch this show, that show, and so on. And that way you can't really have a conversation, and you can't really confront each other or talk to each other. So often I tell couples, I think the first suggestion is try to move the television out of the bedroom. And I can't tell you, when I first suggested it, I didn't realize how important that is until I saw the resistance. People looked at me in shock. They said, what are you talking about? How could you do that? It's like cutting off my arms. That was not what they said, but that was like the equivalent, like I was telling them to cut off their arms. Now think about it for a moment. That's how addicted we become. And it becomes an excellent crutch. We got to watch the Late Show. We got to watch this. We got to watch that. And you're not necessarily even watching it. Or people don't even need a television. All you got to have is your little mobile with you. And I had a letter from a woman who says to me, my husband is sleeping with another person. And since she concludes her letter, that someone sleeping with someone else, that's what she put it, not a person. And it ends up being he's sleeping with his mobile, which can be, maybe not quite the same type of affair that you would say is a sexual affair, but nevertheless, it's centering your life around. This is a common problem that we're having. Now, when both parties in a couple, both of them are doing it, it doesn't mean it's better. It just means that both of them have their escapes. When you think about it as an outsider, if you were to look at this, and if you think that you as a child, that's what your parents were doing, you tell me what kind of life is going on at home if that's happening. So when exactly is there a conversation going on? And does anybody even want to have a conversation? So we Jews have a thing called Shabbos. And Shabbos is a Friday night, the family comes together. Well, that alone is an unbelievable opportunity that once a week, locked in, you have to sit with your family. Yeah, and you can't run out anywhere else. I mean, obviously the goal is not to force anyone, but it's to be an opportunity that's locked in. This is a time where you spend with each other and not with technology and not with other things. But again, the problem is that we've become so addicted to our drugs and our gadgets. It's not easy pill to swallow, as I mentioned. But all this just indicates how we become part of the problem. It's no longer, so when then someone says, I'm not happy, you're not happy, you're not even ready to drop your crutches and have a conversation with somebody. You ready to do that? Then we can talk. So people want a solution while they still maintain, it's like someone saying, get me off the drugs while they're taking drugs. You can't do that. There has to be a certain weaning off and a real focus. So somewhere you have to give up something, which is always a difficult thing to do. But let me go back and now explain what the real story behind the scenes is. This is all speaking about so-called the present situation. So how do you look at all this thing? So you're going back to Sun Tzu's line that battles are won before they're fought, or even more importantly, this week's chapter. So let's look at what it means. What it's telling you is like this. Who are you as a human being? Do you even have any clue who you are? You know, many people will say, I am a sum of the parts of my life. That's who I am. I'm a product of my parents and their upbringing and their attitudes. I'm a product of my education, my culture, my community. You know, the list goes on. And then my life experiences. I got married and then I got divorced. And it was terrible. It was bitter. So now I have that also that defines who I am. So essentially, a person that says that as my identity is defined by the sum of the parts of my circumstances. Most people would, maybe you might not like that definition, but most people don't have a better definition. Because no one's ever given them an objective description of their identity. What else am I if I'm not a product of my life experiences? This is where one of the most fundamental ideas and thoughts, and maybe the most fundamental, of Judaism and Torah is that's absolutely incorrect. Everything I just said right now, if that's your identity, you're in big trouble. And I don't mean that to be in a threat. I didn't mean it to sound threatening or frightening. When I say big trouble, it doesn't mean you may be in trouble right now, but you're setting yourself up to real trouble because you have nothing to stand on your own. You're a product of everything around you. So you're basically betting that things are just going to work out. What Judaism teaches, the most important principle of all, is right in the beginning of the Torah, when it describes the human being created by God. So after creating all the creatures, God says, I'll now create the human being in my image, in the divine image. The actual language is in our image, which is another discussion why it says our. But one of the interpretations that you can perhaps understand that with is because God says the image of God is male and female. So that's an our, that's a plural. That even though the male and female are initially one entity, like an androgynous creature and then separated, but there is two dimensions, the male and female called divine counterparts. So there's two dimensions, the Kabbalah and Hasidic thought teaches there's two dimensions to the divine. But the focus I'm focusing on is the divine image. You're a human being, each one of us sitting right here in this room, everyone listening, everyone on earth, created in the divine image. It doesn't say the human being is an intelligent creature, an emotional creature, a business creature. It says you're created in the divine image. Why is that so vital? Because it says your identity is not man-made. You're not a product of your parents. You're not a product of your environment. You're a product of God, and you are actually an image of God. You're a piece of the divine. Now, the other factors, family, environment, and so on, is where your soul, your divine soul, entered into this world and may be impacted by and not just maybe, you will be impacted by your environment and childhood and parents and education and so on. But that's not who you are. So essentially, if you really want to put it in dramatic terms, you can say that who you are may have been hijacked by what you've become. Because if family and environment and so on did not nurture your divine self and self-confidence and self-esteem, then yes, what happens is your inner so-called divine identity has now become kidnapped, held hostage, covered up. Think of you, let's say, born with, let's say, musical talent. And you may be even aware of it. It's not irrelevant whether you're aware or not. But no one has ever allowed you to actualize it. And when you tried to actualize it, you were silenced and told, no, music is not for you. We don't play music here. What would happen to you? What happened would be that you have a latent and natural skill for something that never found actualization. Besides the frustration, what would happen is you'd have to suddenly shape and create a new identity to replace your real natural identity. So how many of us have done that? And not necessarily in a conscious way. It's a product of our lives. We may have become something that our parents wanted us to be, but it's not who we really are. That our environment wanted us to be, that culture and so on. So essentially what you have is a situation where you have, in a sense, wandered away from who you really are and become something else. Now, I'm talking in extreme terms. Obviously, if you really think about it, it's not necessarily extreme to the point that you've become from instead of being a, you've become Z. But it could be 10, 20, 30, 40% of you has never really seen the light of day because it's never emerged. And you may not even be aware that you have that part inside of you. That's why it's so vital that the Torah begins with the first principle. You are not a product of anything or anybody on earth. You are a product of the divine. As a matter of fact, you're a divine image. You are a divine creature. And nobody gave that to you, and nobody can take it from you. And that, in turn, causes that you be indispensable and that you have something unique to contribute that no one but you can contribute, period. That's the first and most important statement of all, because if you don't have that, everything else will be compromised. That's why the Torah begins with that. Now let's go to the verse in this week's chapter. So what's cliche l'milchama? It means, yes, life may consist of battles, many battles. But are you a battler? Is that your life's destiny for you to be a warrior? The answer is no. You go out to war. Why do you go out? Because that's not who you are. Whenever you say the word going out, it means that you are one thing and now you have to go out to do something. You're going out from your natural self to a different type of state that you need to do because of whatever reason. The reason that we'll discuss is because God sends us into a hostile world with the need to subjugate and refine and sublimate the universe. But that's not you. You are an entity that's not a warrior. You're not defined by the battles of your life. So no matter what happens in your life, no matter what hostile forces there are, you're not defined by them. That's kiseitse. So one word changes. Instead of saying, go wage war, go out to wage war, out changes the whole picture. There's you and there's going out of yourself. It also implies another thing, that any battle you fight should not be fought on your turf. It should be fought outside of your turf. That's why you'll see one of the biggest strategies in battle is to make sure the war is on the enemy's turf, not on yours. As soon as you have that going, you're already in a better position because at least your home base is not compromised. Look, frankly, one of the main factors why the United States is a superpower, besides many others, is because both world wars were not fought in the United States. They were fought in Europe. So Europe was first ravaged by World War I, then World War II. America was involved, and we've lost many, many soldiers and many military. But the war was not fought. There was no disruption fundamentally in the routines of this country. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons they continued the baseball season and World Series in 1940s, even though people were being killed by the thousands or hundreds of thousands in Europe, and people said, how could you be playing baseball? They said it was to keep the morale of the country going. Okay, arguably that's an argument. To keep the confidence, to keep the morale is very important for any country to fight a war. So technically speaking, psychologically, the same is true. That you want a war to be fought outside of you, not inside of you. That if you have to do something that's confrontational, let it be, but it shouldn't be one that occupies and consumes your psyche and yourself, your being, yourself. You'll see the best people who know how to fight wars in that way are the ones that win because they are never really shaken. They have that presence and that composure, that the war is being fought outside of them, not inside of them. I once met one of the top tennis players in the world. And I asked him, I say, sometimes you have these matches, like nail biters at the end of a match. And even if you're watching it, you tremble because it's like so tense. And you think to yourself, how could these players like serve and play without any tremble in their arm? And so he told me that the reason is you train for years and years for exactly that moment where you see it as something happening outside of you, not inside of you. You have to do what you have to do, but you never let it, so you have a complete inner peace, what some people call being in the zone, where you're like the eye of the tornado. You could have the whole world turning upside down, but at the heart, at the eye, there's a certain inner tranquility and peace. Now, I hope, some of you may have been blessed. I was blessed to see a few people in my life, not many, that were that way. You could have so much turmoil and chaos going on, but they had an inner peace, that when you're in their presence, you felt that type of peace. Some people just have that. Unfortunately, not most, because unfortunately some of us would all deserve to have it, but because of life circumstances, we become ourselves part of the problem. We become frightened. A frightened person is going to frighten the rest of us, right? But when you see a crisis and you see someone that's not frightened, not because they're naive and detached and aloof and don't know what's happening, but because they have that inner confidence, that gives a tremendous confidence to anyone that's around you. When you have people like that in your life, that type of contagious effect is unbelievable. In times of war, it's actually the case. You see battles, no battle in war, real war I'm talking now, doesn't have setbacks. So how do you get beyond a setback? Let's say you're fighting a war, everything is going well, but then suddenly the enemy makes an attack, a surprise attack or whatever it is, and they suddenly move forward and advance and you're retreating. So why doesn't suddenly everybody start running for their lives? Because you have people who are trained, hopefully a commander-in-chief and generals and higher staff, higher brass, who have the experience of saying, okay, we lost this battle, but let's regroup, re-strategize, and they have a confidence that we can do it. Which in turn, this is why it's so important in the military that you have absolute obedience to authority, because you can't have room where one person says, I don't like this plan, or it frightens me, or else the whole integrity of the military will be compromised if someone does that. So you have to have that confidence that spills over through all the ranks, all the way to the basic foot soldier, that keeps that confidence going. That's more important than all the strategy in the world. Because if you lose that, then you run, then you surrender, you defeat, surrender, forfeiting and so on. So to go back to the psychological, that's why it's so vital that the Torah says, cliche. Wars are never fought inside of you, they're always fought outside of you. And if your life is one where the battle has entered inside your mind and heart and soul, you have to know that's an aberration. That's like as if an infection has entered into your system and you got to get rid of it. We'll soon discuss how. But the first thing you need to know, it doesn't belong there. We need to fight battles at times, so be it, but they have to be fought outside of yourself. You need to know yourself is not defined by it. And that leads to the second word, where it says alevecha. That's exactly why it says it. You're not fighting with an equal. You're always above your enemy, because you're always internally completely secure and completely intact. You need to fight with an enemy, yes, but the enemy is always outside of you and always beneath you. So what Sun Tzu said was that all battles are fought all battles are won before they're fought. The Torah really describes it. And the real reason for that is why? Because it all comes down to who you are. And you know something? Even if you lose a battle, but it doesn't disrupt and does not reflect on your inner self, you've not lost. The battle may have been lost. Some of us so invest our destinies in the battles we fight. So if we win a battle, that means I'm a better person. If I lose the battle, I am now destroyed. I always think to myself about those that commit suicide when there was the stock crash in the 20s, and recently the recent stock crash. You think to yourself, what could be a person? He has a wife and family, made millions and millions of dollars, and then suddenly realized that he's lost all that money. Okay, terrible. But to go ahead and take your life has to state that his net worth was defined by his self-worth was defined by his net worth. That money was more important than his life. Now, if you really think about it as an outsider, I'm not judging anyone, but if you think of an outsider, what happened? His whole identity became so much defined by something. As soon as that thing was gone, he has no reason to live. What does that tell you about a person? That tells you that his definition of life and value of life has nothing to do with reality. It has to do with his own distortion, where he's determined this is what life is valuable. So he could jump out of a window because he had tremendous financial losses, turn his wife and children into widow and orphan, and all the tragedy that comes with that. Besides the selfishness of it, but it means what tragedy that he's got to some point. I'm not talking now again mental illness or depression. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. I'm talking about simply because of financial loss. That's a perfect example where a person, it's not cliche l'mochama and not aleivecha. It's a person whose entire life is defined by a particular identity. That identity is taken away, so he's over with. People who are true winners may lose battles in life. I didn't say you don't lose a battle, but you're always a winner because the battle didn't define you. So you lost a battle. So what? So you move on. There's plenty of other things to do. You've we call them investments. You've diversified. So you have other eggs in other baskets. When the previous Chabad Rebbe told his Soviet captors, when they pointed the gun at his head and said, "Rebbe, this gun has made many people this gun has made many people cooperate," and he responded in Yiddish. He said, "It can this tzatzke, this gadget, this toy, can frighten someone that has one world and many gods, but not someone who has one God and many worlds." What was he saying? That what do you think? Killing me is going to frighten me because my identity is defined by biological life? Obviously, v'chai behem, we Jews celebrate life. We don't celebrate death. But don't think that by taking my physical life, my life is over. So it means even if he was killed, he wasn't. He ended up winning and living and being victorious, and the people who were pointing the gun at him ended up being shot. But even if he was, he didn't really die because his spirit was not killed. 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust in the most tragic way. We don't even have graves for them. We don't have, and the humanization of it and so on. And we all know how it makes our blood boil. And yet, look at the dignity that they're accorded. And look at the real vengeance that the Jews that remained. The vengeance was what? Not to go attack Germans, was to have children and grandchildren, and to build and to honor them by saying, for every one of you that's lost, we will replace you many times over and what you would have contributed to this world. That's the Jewish approach. That's not some cop-out. That's because you do not identify with the death as being who we are. Yes, we were killed. We were tortured. But that doesn't define our identities. So you can never take away the dignity of a human soul, even if you kill it in this world. That's the extent, because it's not identified by people's actions. As I mentioned before, the single most fundamental principle is that we were created in the divine image. We are not a product of anything that's man-made, not our parents, not our environment, not our cultures, not our communities. If they're all there to help nurture and help support who we are, great. But we are not a product, a sum of the parts of our life experiences. So even if a person has suffered, that doesn't mean they've become a sufferer. They've suffered. Something's happened to you. Every war is fought outside of you, never inside. Now the question is, how do you get to a place like that? Let's say, okay, great. But what happens if the infection has already invaded you? And the wars are being fought inside of your heart and mind, and you've already been demoralized, and your attitude to life is one of resignation. Let's say you grew up, and I'm just using it as an example, in a home that was not a home, it was a war zone. Parents fighting with each other, resentment, anger, constant negative energy. So now that is it's infested inside. It's infested and has invaded your being. Like no different than I said before, toxins or infection invading your psyche, your body. Here it's invaded your soul, your heart and mind. So it's no longer cliche l'milchama. You're not going out to war. The war has been brought into your home. To your, when I say home, not just your physical home, but your being. What do you deal with then? It's one thing if we know that we have to bring up our families in a way to protect our children and always realize that any hostile forces and all the battles of life have to be fought outside of you. You have to fight them, but they don't define you. You're defined by much higher things. And any enemy is not your equal, alevecha. You're always above. Or to use again the Sun Tzu's words, that every war is won before the fight. So it's a lot about mental state of mind, your mental attitude, your emotional attitudes, and so on. So that's one thing. If you bring someone up that way, great. But as I mentioned before, statistics show, and we don't even know the statistics, that most people are preoccupied with more negative energy than positive energy. If you were to count the hours of your day, your waking hours, of how much energy is invested in negative thoughts or fighting negative thoughts, as opposed to promoting positive ones, you know yourself. I can't speak for everyone again, but from what I've seen in my life, most people are preoccupied with the negative, and therefore resentments and bitterness and whatever it may be. You know, it's not fair, all those type of sentiments. So now it's part of you. So the infection is within you. So then, of course, we have the principle in the Torah that says, Ein chavush materes atzmei, which means that chavush is someone who's tied up, is bound in fetters. Now think of someone who's bound up in prison. You can't free yourself. A person who's bound is fettered cannot free themselves on their own. In more psychological terminology, means if you're subjective, you can't free yourself because you are subjective. You're the problem. How could a subjective person suddenly become objective when they themselves don't see it? It's like the one with a blind spot is not going to free themselves from a blind spot. Or using more scientific language, some scientists put it, you cannot change the system from within the system. Because any change is from within the system. It would be like your enemy telling you, you know what, I'll help you out and let's get rid of your enemy. Obviously, that's not going to work exactly. So, psychologically speaking, what frees us? That's why we must have an objective opinion. That's why it's such a great, important principle that aseh lecha rav, appoint for yourself a mentor, and knei lecha chaver, acquire a friend, because then you have fresh air. If you've been breathing toxic air for 20 years, you may not even know it's toxic. You've gotten so used to it, you don't know. And then someone tells you, you know something? I don't know how you can live here. This place is toxic. And you say, 1 second, I'm all right. And suddenly someone tells you something you never even thought is possible. You know, I see this very often when people, especially growing up, as I said, in battle zones and war zones in their home, and they suddenly see something in a home that's peaceful, they're like shocked. They say, I didn't know that's possible. People who had distorted models for love in marriages that were distorted, that becomes their standard. And they don't even expect that there's something better. Now, even if you're an intelligent person, you read a book, you see a movie, you see there's another way, but emotionally, you are shaped by what you saw. So even if your mind can imagine a different scenario, it's more or less a fantasy. Emotionally, it's very difficult to see because that's what you expect. I've witnessed this sadly many times. I hope not as many as I would have liked. More than I would have liked. That came out the wrong way. We're speaking to someone, and like suddenly you lift up your hand like reflexively like this, and the person flinches. I'm not talking about someone like you're trying to punch them. Just a regular, natural movement of your hand like that, and the other person flinches. And you figure out pretty quickly, once you understand the symptoms, that this is a person who probably grew up in an environment where someone who raised their hand to them, and there was a reason to flinch. So at some point, every time you see a movement of a hand, you will right away reflexively react. You know, if someone one time hits you, fine. 2 times, 3 times, but after a while, you develop in your mind, your neurons get wired As they say, as your neurons are fired, that's how they get wired. And you wire yourself to knowing that you have to be careful. People who have real issues with trust in relationships, you can almost always trace it back to their childhood, that there was problems with trust in their homes. So it's natural. They never saw trust, or they saw compromised trust. They saw limited trust. When a person who loved you also hurt you, you begin to expect that anyone that loves you is going to hurt you at some point. Now, in extreme situations, it's actually very, very direct and very blatant. In more subtler situations, you don't always see it, but it's still there, the element of distrust. People who really, really trust, and I'm not talking about naive, juvenile trust of a baby. I'm talking about adults that trust, more or less, almost all cases you could say is because they grew up in something, they learned that trust was a virtue that they could trust. They had people they could trust. But if you never had people you could trust, why suddenly would you suddenly trust people? Because what? Because you turned 30 years old, now you're suddenly trusting? On the contrary, you haven't seen anybody for the first 20 years of your life that you could trust. Why would you suddenly start trusting people? Of course, I should throw into the picture that you don't trust yourself, and you don't think you could be trusted. Obviously, you're not going to trust others. Kol ha-posel b'mumei posel, as they say, which means if you see a blemish in someone else, it's usually a sign that you have some form of that blemish, or else you wouldn't have seen it. It wouldn't bother you. In the words of the Baal Shem Tov, everything is a mirror image. Some things you don't really, you don't always see. Why don't you see it? Because you don't really have it inside of you. That's why some of us can't even imagine certain atrocities, because we're not capable of it. As soon as you're capable of something, you see it usually more easier than if you're not. But all this leads back to, so how do you deal with this? So number one is you have to introduce fresh air. Because if the infection has invaded, which means that the battle is being fought not not outside of you, but within you, you must have help. Simple as that. I don't mean that in a patronizing or condescending way. On the contrary, I see it as a strength. Help means, just like somebody who's drowning, needs someone to throw them a life raft, or as I said, in chavish mater satzme, you're in fetters, someone has to throw you a rope. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. We all need each other. And having a good friend, a good mentor, that's not judgmental, and it's not not just someone who's doing, looks at you like a Rachmanis case, just out of mercy, but a true friend. What are friends for? That we all have times where we need to turn to each other. Hillel said it best, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? So obviously it all begins with that. But if I am for myself, what am I? So there's nothing wrong to be able to say, obviously you want to find the right type of person, but that right type of person can bring fresh air that you will not be able to introduce into your own life. This is one of the hardest leaps to make, frankly, especially for a person with pride, that they need advice from someone else. Now, we have no problem hearing that when it comes to, let's say, legal advice, financial advice. Even there, frankly, ask a lot of lawyers and accountants and they'll tell you, people hire us, but they don't listen to us. Because, again, emotionally, nobody wants to hear from their accountant that you made 10 big mistakes that cost the company and you the $10 million this year. So you try to avoid it. But at least you could say there, because, listen, you're not going to go buy a home without some legal representation. You're not going to do certain things because it's really pretty obvious. It'll be just destructive because you don't know how to handle a given situation. But when it comes to emotional issues and psychological issues, that's where there's far more resistance, because human pride comes into play. And it's very hard to acknowledge that I'm breathing toxic air, that maybe I'm living a lie, that my identity that I think I am is not really who I am, and that the battles that I'm fighting are not what define me. I mean, I've been guilty of this. I'm sure others have been guilty of this. When you become emotionally invested in a particular position and you feel you have to fight, let's say, it's very hard for you to hear from someone, just give up. Because you're convinced and you start saying to yourself, that person doesn't really get you, they don't know all the nuances and all the details. It's very hard to get objective advice once you've emotionally determined that you have an approach to something. Because you're convinced that you're doing it the right way because you know better. And then later, you discover a little time later that that person was right. But it's only after if the air clears and you lose your complete emotional bias. I remember hearing once there was a situation I was involved in. Thank God it didn't affect me directly, but I was involved in part of the consultations. and someone was adamant to take someone else to court. It was a battle. And I remember I suggested him, I think before you go into it, why don't you talk to someone that is, I don't want to call it battle weary. That's not the topic. That's not the point I want to make this evening. But someone who's battle, what do they call it? Battle tested. Their metal has been tested. There's a word for it. Someone who's gone through battles in life and has seen many scenarios. And so then at least know what you're getting into. So it's not just some theoretical thing. So we did that. I helped him find someone that was a really savvy, experienced attorney. And he said to him, there's two things you need to know when you go into litigation in law. Well, besides the obvious, that the litigation has nothing to do with justice, has to do with who has more money and more staying power. That's what that the guy knew. But he had the money. That wasn't the problem. But there's two other things you need to know. That if you're going into it, you got to go till the end. Which means you can't pull out in halfway. You got to go all the way till the end. If you don't want to go into it, don't go into it. But if you're going to go all the way till the end. And number two, know that everybody who says they're your ally today will probably not be your ally once the battle starts. So people will promise you all kinds of friendships and I'm behind you and blah, 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 and they'll help you and this and that. Most will not be there. Anyway, I remember hearing this and it made sense to me and I said so. So he decided to go ahead anyway. And today he'll be the first to tell you he made both those mistakes. He really wasn't ready to go through all the way and he didn't. He dropped out in the middle after losing enough money. And number two, almost everyone who started out as his ally didn't become his enemy, but they all pulled away. You know, who was interested in fighting a prolonged battle? So all of us are going to be guilty in our lives of this type of subjective attitude. So the faster we are smart and we realize that you have to ask an objective person whether you're breathing fresh air, you can't ask yourself or someone who's already biased like you. The faster you do that, the faster you get into a cliche l'milchama attitude, that battles are outside of you, not within you. And the second thing, which maybe should be the first thing, is reinforcing who you really are. If indeed you've become a product of your environment and a product of your circumstances and community and family and so on, so how do you deal with that? The only way to deal with that is to find out who you are really. And there's no more direct way than doing that is understanding your soul. The more you understand the dynamics of your soul, know thyself is the best possible way to recalibrate and redefine your identity. Because if your identity was but defined by A, B, C, D, and in fact there's another E that you've never looked at, how do you get to that? Is by discovering who you really are. And that it requires a deliberate and consistent effort of understanding yourself, understanding what makes you tick. Not what others tell you make you tick, what really makes you tick. What exactly did God have in mind for you when he sent you to this earth? What is your soul made up of? What type of personality? What would you have been like had all those influences in your life not affected you? Now this doesn't mean suddenly you'll be free of it all, but it begins giving you another perspective to contrast with, to juxtapose over your existing sense of identity over what your real identity is. Now this again is not easy to do because someone who's already has a view of themselves, a perspective, is not really interested in saying, oh, you know what, let me get another perspective on myself. It's not comfortable. It's very disorienting to think that way. Because suddenly everything you may have believed in, everything that you thought was really defined you, is not necessarily the case. So of course then we're left with two options. Do I live in the comfort zone of my distortions? At least I'm comfortable in my distorted view. Or am I ready to challenge myself and not be so comfortable, but I may find the truth? So now it comes down to how committed are we to the truth. Now most people, when you ask them, are you committed to the truth? They say, of course. I always want to hear the truth. So there's this classic story, I've shared it a number of times. It's like a Hasidic parable of this man who dedicated his entire life searching for the truth. The truth. Capital T. 2 capital T's. And he goes from one academy to the next, from one school to the next, from every school of thought. He's looking for the truth. And he really is sincere. He's dedicated his life. Years roll by and he finds all kinds of truths. This truth, that truth. He's still looking for the truth. He's already reached now, ripe old age. He finally meets a sage. And the sage sees who he is and asks him questions. And after so-called interviewing him, inquiring, he says, so you're really dedicated to looking? He says, yes, my whole life I've been looking for the truth. I left behind many different opportunities, financial ones and others, just to find the truth. He says, how dedicated are you? How far would you go to find the truth? He says, I would do anything. I'd give my life if I was able to see the ultimate truth. So the sage says to him, okay, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. You're making a big statement that you're ready to give your life, but we'll give you a chance. And he instructs him to travel, gives him directions to travel to some distant land, all the details and so on. He says, there you'll find the truth you're looking for. He embarks on this journey. He's excited because he felt that something here that he has never seen before. Finally ends up in this place. It's in a deep forest. He travels. Middle of the deep forest, he suddenly sees this very bright lit up palace. Middle of nowhere. He enters, and there it's even brighter. Inside he comes in, long chambers and halls with candles and flames burning, rows upon rows upon rows, like as far as he can see. It's like a house of light with all these different candles. As he's observing this spectacle, suddenly a certain man comes over to him and says, how can I help you? So he tells him, this is the sage sent me here and told me I can find my truth here. He says, yes, this is called the world of Emes, the world of truth. This is the house of truth. And what are all these flames, he asks? He says, these flames are the true stories of each person in this world. Every person's story is told in the flame. And if you study each flame, you could see that person's life in there. You could see how the flame flickers, how large the flame is, how small the flame is, the different shapes and colors and so on. He says, and those bright, fresh flames, these are newborn children. They're just beginning their lives with all the potential. And you see those flames that are about to burn out are the ones that are about to die and leave this earth. So of course this man says tentatively, he says to him, so can I see my flame? So he tells me, yeah, go down row row Z, row L, column this and this, and go check out your flame. So he slowly makes his way. He doesn't know how he's going to react, what he's going to see. Finally gets there. As he comes closer, he's not so sure that's his flame, but then he realizes it is. It's about to burn out, meaning that his life is about to end. So he gets all suddenly completely disturbed because he's like finding the truth. He wants to live long now with this new truth that he's finding. And he's so shaken by it, he's not even thinking. He looks around quickly to see if anybody's watching. And he takes the oil from another flame and pours it into his, to give himself a little longer life. And suddenly, as he's doing it, he could sense the eyes of the master of the house, the caretaker, watching him and saying to him, so you're ready to pay any price for the truth, right? Even giving your life. So the moral of the story, of course, is that many of us are dedicated. We love to hear that we're already dedicated to truth and integrity. Just tell me my truth, I'm ready to hear it. In fact, most people are not ready to hear their own truth. I don't think anybody really wants to know the naked truth without any filters and veils. It can be very uncomfortable to hear your truth. We want to hear it somewhat packaged. We don't want to hear a lie, but we want it to be something we can digest. Because it's not that simple. We live in a world where we have already a certain self-image, a position in life, whether a mother, a father, children of our parents, a certain position in our community, at work. And I know why we suddenly want to disrupt it all to find out your truth is completely nothing that you even thought it is. So I'm not making a case here that any of us should have to go cold turkey and do that. That's why we actually have a principle in Jewish thought that says La'olam yasik adam b'terem mitzvah shalei l'shma, v'metech shalei l'shma ba l'shma, which means a person should always do things for ulterior motives. And from the ulterior motive, you'll come to a pure motive. Why? Because we all need something we need crutches. That's how it is. Children need to be told, okay, you'll get this prize, this award, if you do so and so. And adults need different type of awards. It may be honor, it may be respect, it may be whatever it is. Elam haza, elam haba, this world, the world to come. Maimonides has a whole chapter on this in chapter 10 in Hilchos Tshuva, connected to this time of the year, Elul. So he talks about this process, that one man, Abraham, Avram Oyevi, Abraham called my beloved, God calls him my beloved. He committed to truth because it was true. That's a rare individual, and it takes a lot of work to get to that stage. The rest, you do it, maybe not for material reward, spiritual reward, for the satisfaction that you're doing the right thing. The Baal Shem Tov was once praying for someone. A woman had come, whose child was very sick, dying. So Baal Shem Tov began praying for the child. And from heaven came a voice that said, this child is decreed to die. You cannot change the destiny. And the Baal Shem Tov insisted. And the cry from heaven came and said, if you change the destiny, obviously a tzaddik geyser, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mekayim, a tzaddik decrees God will fulfill, but there'll be consequences because you're disrupting the plan. You're shifting things. But he continued to pray. The child recovered. But then a voice came from heaven and said, okay, Baal Shem Tov, because you did something that changed the course of history, you will have to face a certain serious consequence, and that is you'll lose your share in the world to come, which is a serious thing. Lose your share in this world. This world is temporary. The world to come is not temporary. So it's like losing your whole spiritual life. For a person like the Baal Shem Tov, that's far worse than physical life. And instead of crying and being sad, the Baal Shem Tov got up and started dancing. So students asked him, what are you dancing about? What's the celebration? You lost your share in the world to come. So he says, because now I can serve God for no ulterior motive at all. Because I'll never have a world to come, so I have no strings attached. So the end of the story, they say that when they heard that in heaven, that he now has the pleasure of serving for no motive at all, because he doesn't have a world to, schar in the reward, spiritual reward, they said, no, that pleasure we will not give him. Give him back his share in the world to come. Okay, some versions have that end, some don't. So you could choose whatever ending you like. We have alternative endings. But there's a message in it. The point is the message. The message is that it's not that simple to just do things completely for truth, because we are not people that are 100% truth. We live in a duplicitous world. We live in a deceptive world. And even though many of us may have integrity and truth, but to say 100%, it's not that easy. Even if we aspire to it. Because it means to facing certain realities that sometimes we're not ready to. Now, if you're standing in front of a real Rebbe, or someone who can help you find your truth, they will not only tell you this is your truth. They're wise enough to understand it has to be couched in terms that you can relate to, and you can grow toward. You have to own it. As they say with Kabbalists, they say those that know don't say, and those that say don't know. So whenever I give a course, so to speak, and they have these classes in different places, they call it beginner's Kabbalah, advanced Kabbalah, I always begin with that introduction. I say that the Kabbalists, they say those that know don't say, and those that say don't know. So that means anything I say means that I don't know. So what do you do then? The point of the matter is that truths, the real wise truths, are the ones that good teachers will not tell you in your face, this is your truth. They'll give you the tools, and they'll give you enough information for you to be able to figure it out. But you have to be wise enough and courageous enough to take the journey. That's the Torah way. The Torah doesn't have magic pills. You press this button and suddenly the truth comes from it. It all comes down to where you are and your readiness and prepared, and how prepared you are to find your truth. And that nobody can give to you. The courage and the commitment to that integrity is really your call. You could have good examples around you. You can choose to have good friends and good influences. But you could also choose the path of denial, the path of comfort zones, which are always the enemy of truth, because comfort zone means, you're comfortable. Why do you want to rock the boat? But ultimately, going back to the central theme here, means your identity is most likely not what you think it is. You may have some glimmer of it, but it's most likely not what you think of it. It's much more what has shaped you. Again, parental effect, attitudes, schooling, community, culture, society. That's where our identities are mostly shaped. So what's the counterforce to that? Is two things. Having objective forces in your life that help you see things that you can't see, because you're not going to be able to see your own blind spots. And two, having a true commitment to understanding what your soul is like. And understanding what it's made up of, its components, literally like understanding what your body is like. Like what are your muscles and your nerves and your circulatory and your heart and your lungs like before it was toxified by the world in which we live. You look at a newborn child, you see they breathe, healthy child. Their lungs are being used 100%. You see all their mechanisms are exactly the way it was meant to be. A healthy child. In technology, they say version 8 of an iPhone is better than version 1. With human beings, it's the other way around. The version 1 is always better than version 2. As we get older, the machine starts wearing down, right? And but what you want to know is when you want to see something healthy, so what do? You get an x-ray of lungs, and you always see there's another set of lungs that are healthy, and then you can compare and juxtapose. So the same thing is spiritually. To be able to get a good objective sense of your identity, you want to know what your soul looks like. And now, what is your soul? How is it behaving? And then you get a certain contrast between who you are and what you're doing. And they're never the same. You ask most people who are you, they give you their business card. That's the closest thing we can identify ourselves with. Our business is what I do, but this is what you do, it's not who you are. So those are the two main things. And what better time in the month of El is a month of introspection, of understanding ourselves. When we say tshuva, what does tshuva mean? So everybody translates tshuva as repentance. Repentance actually is not only inaccurate, it's actually a contradictory meaning to tshuva. Tshuva means to return. Repent means to leave. Repent your ways. You did this, and you're no longer going to do it, you're going to do something new. Right? Tshuva means to return. So what are you returning to exactly? It goes back to the same principle that I said earlier about our identity. Tshuva means to return to who you really are, not who you think you are. You may have a superimposed personality, and tshuva means you're going back to the real personality, the real you. Sometimes tshuva is toshuv kei, the return to God. The ruach toshuv el elikim asher nasan. The spirit returns to its divine source. So there is an element of repentance, regret of an iniquity, error, intentional and unintentional, mistakes we've made. But that's like cleaning the dust up, so in other words, in order for you to be able to then enter back into your inner self. So the journey really through this month of Elul, and then of course next month of the high holidays themselves, Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, is really a journey back into your real self. That's what it's about. When Moses stood on the mountain during these days, praying for the Jews who built the golden calf, what was his justification? They did a deliberate act of betrayal of the worst sort, the second commandment. You shouldn't have false gods. Right after 39 days after they heard it. So it wasn't something that was easy to defend. But he didn't defend their crime. He said to God, they made the mistake and they're responsible. But their essence is not defined by that mistake. You need to give me hope so I can help them go back and find themselves. They betrayed themselves and their own souls. That's why Yom Kippur, which is the day that Moses returns after his 40-day journey that started Rosh Chodesh El, the beginning of this month, with the second tablets, with forgiveness, Salachti Kidvarecha, as we'll say after Kol Nidre. What did he achieve exactly? He prevailed on God that the Jewish people, beyond all their sins and their wounds, at heart really lies something absolutely pure. And if you give me the power, he said to God, of forgiveness, I will help them access that part so they can return to their real selves and in the process cleanse the so-called outer layers of infections that invaded their souls. It's based on the principle that you are not the sins that you do. You're not the mistakes you do. We make many mistakes, and many of them are not that forgivable. But it never ends up being you. That's why Afal Pi Shechata Yisrael Hu. Even though one sins, you still remain Yisrael. That doesn't mean there's no sin. It says clearly sin. And it doesn't mean the sin is forgiven. It just means you're not defined. Yitamu chatoyim v'loy chaytim. The sin should be erased, not the sinner. Think of a parent and children. Let's say your child did something really terrible, God forbid. Still your child. And something that I'm not talking about you going to denial and blaming others. You're fully aware and cognizant your child did something really wrong. Will you stop loving your child if you're a healthy person? You never stop loving. On the contrary, your love is what pains you so much. You love the child in the core, and they did something that's so antithetical to everything you know about your child. So the love is going to compel you to find a way to help the child heal. An unhealthy parent will either deny there's no problem and nothing happened, or they'll take out all their anger, and because of their reputation and their whatever it is, will just punish the child with no end and just demoralize and destroy the child further. A healthy parent will not overlook what happened, but will distinguish between what happened and who that person is. Just like we do with ourselves. Just like we do with people we love. Which is why when you talk about rebuking Jews, especially in the month of Elul, and this is one of the big, unfortunate tragedies of, throughout history. Even Isaiah the prophet, Yeshaya Navi, when he rebuked the Jews, God punished him. He said about the Jews that their lips were contaminated, and God caused them to have a plague on his lips. Even Isaiah the prophet, who was a lover of Jews. And God says in the pasuk in Zechariah, I think, someone that touches the Jewish people is like they attacking the pupil of my eye. Why? Because the idea of rebuking, first of all, is with God's instructions. When a prophet is told to do so, it's one thing. But you're rebuking. Who are you rebuking? Who are you to rebuke? Who appointed you? And especially when you know what it says in Yerushalmi that we're all parts of one body. So if one part of the body is ailing, the rest of the body is ailing. So what do you think? By dismissing some other part and saying that they're no good and you think you're better, that's part of your body. If they're ailing, it's affecting you. And most important, what it comes down to is how we look at each other. For somebody to be able to just rebuke someone and dismiss them because they think they're better is the fundamental flaw in the whole philosophy of Judaism. Neshama shenasata bi tahirihi. We say in the morning, the soul you've given me is pure. And then you've created it, you've shaped it. I once asked a rabbi, without mentioning names, was known for his sharp tongue about Jews that were not like himself. So let's say even he's the biggest tzaddik on earth. So I asked him, I once had an opportunity to talk to him for a certain reason. So I said to him, let me ask you, you're a posek, you rule laws. We're talking in Yiddish. If a Jew that you've criticized, and more than criticized, who doesn't keep Shabbos, kosher, nothing, and all the names you've called him, if he wants to pray tomorrow morning, right? Let's say he decides he wants to pray. What would you paskin? What would be your ruling? Should he say neshama shenasata bi tahirihi or not? Thank you. He looked at me, I remember. He didn't want to answer. I think he got the message. I wasn't trying to rebuke him, because that would be defeating the purpose. But of course, he could not rule that person should not say it, because he has to base it on something. So in other words, every soul is pure. The fact that the so-called arteries get infected, or the pathways to the heart get infected, doesn't mean that the heart is infected. That's the whole point. That essentially, if you want to really distinguish Christianity from Judaism, that's what it is. Unfortunately, Christianity has seeped into some Jewish thinkers where they think that the devil, evil, can actually make you evil. There's no such thing in Judaism to become evil. Evil is never more powerful than good. It's a force to contend with, but it's never more powerful. There's always one God. There's no two gods. There's no God and a devil that are equal forces. And within us, the Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara are not equal either. If you look in Chumash, the Yetzer Tov is discussed in chapter 1, where it says about Tzelem Elokim, where they created the divine image. The Yetzer Hara, you only hear about, where? In chapter 2. Yetzer Leva Adam, Ram and Urav, is after it talks about it by the flood. Now, yes, Adam and Eve had sinned, but because the sense, as the Maimonides rules at the end of chapter 2, in the laws of Gerushin, of divorce, in his classic Mishnah Torah, Yad HaChazaka, he says that Yitzre Hu Sha'anseh, that ultimately it is the negative impulses that are the ones that make you be who you're not really. Your natural self is cleaves to the divine and wants to do what God wants. That's the natural self. Everything else is superimposed. It's a very different view than Freudian view, or you could even say also some Christian view, that the essence of who you are is the id and the negative. Now you may be convinced that you're more negative than positive, but that's your own perception. The whole point, is saying absolutely not. You are not the warrior. The warrior is outside of you. And the real you remains always transcends above. It's not the id, but the yid that drives you. The pintele yud, the yid, the spark. So Freud had it half right. He's right that there are forces beneath the surface that shape us. He just only dug halfway. There's further digging. I guess maybe connected to his Jewish mother. He had issues, I assume, with that. He knows about mothers too well, So to sum up, as we travel through this month of Elul, Ani l'deidi v'deidi li, I am to my beloved to me. It's a journey inward to try to find the real you as opposed to the perceived you, and that takes work. It takes objectivity. It takes introspection. It takes study of your own soul. So, yes, many of us are battle weary. Life takes its toll on us, the challenges, the battles, and many of us get weaker as we go. But if you understand the Jewish perspective on it, the truth is that you have a soul in you that's an indomitable and invincible spirit. And it's waiting to be freed. It's waiting to be released. And it's in your hands the key to release it. That's the bottom line message. So as we travel to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the real power of the new year is not just, a new year, we ask for each other forgiveness and try to do something new. It's actually an ability, an opportunity to find out who you really are as opposed to who you think you are. So God bless us all, each of us, to be able to achieve that. And everyone should have, as they say, which is a blessed year, to be inscribed in the book of life with health and nachas from each other, from family, and so on. And we'll continue this journey ourselves. If you don't get the daily emails of 60 days, like the book I did on the 60-day journey going through the month of Elul and Tishrei, so you can subscribe to that online, as well as to the other stuff we send out. And any other way we could help you in your journey, please let us know. If anybody wants the actual book, you could either order it online, or next week I'll bring some books. We're also about to release another 3-volume series called Inside Time, about the mystical perspective on time and its cycles and holidays. As soon as that's ready, I'll bring that as well. Everyone should have a blessed week. Great to see you all. And until next Wednesday, 8:15, 8:30, it should be only good news. Thank you.